CVE is an example of like, well, we already got it right. There already is this one universal identifier that's used, and what we don't want to see is that going backward.
Welcome to Cyber Focus from the McCrary Institute, where we explore the people and ideas shaping and defending our digital world. I'm your host, Frank Cilluffo, and this week I have the privilege of sitting down with a longtime friend and colleague, Nick Leiserson. Nick is currently a senior vice president at the Institute for Security and Technology, has served many years on Capitol Hill, probably the most informed staffer on Capitol Hill working anything cyber, long before cyber was cool, and was also instrumental in our work on the Cyber Solarium Commission. Nick, privileged to sit down with you today. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Frank. Long-time listener, first-time guest.
Well, I'm thrilled you could be here. And I thought we'd start. You and your colleagues at IST recently put out a report on CVE, or the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures program that CISA is administering. What led, firstly, if you can sort of talk our readers through why the CVE program is significant, what it is, and more importantly, and just as importantly, what led you to draft this report now?
Absolutely. Yeah. So CVE, I like to think of it as sort of the lingua franca for your vulnerabilities. It's the universal language that we can all look at and understand what we're talking about. And today, in 2025, we totally take that for granted. You know, if you start talking about vulnerabilities, a CVE number is sure to follow if you get anywhere deep into the conversation. But when you look back at what the landscape looked like before the CVE program, in the original paper from MITRE, a couple guys at MITRE who were network defenders, and they said, hey, we are getting alerts from our vendors, and they're all talking about different things. But when we start picking away at like what is underlying these actual vulnerability alerts we're getting, it seems like they're talking about the same thing. And they said, wouldn't it be better if we had a harmonized way to talk about this so we would know, oh, I've already mitigated that problem, I can move on to the next thing. And I like to think about it in contrast to, say, challenges that we have with threat actors, where I sure as heck can't keep them all straight in my head if it's UNC, XYZ, Volt, Panda, or whatever else it may be. And obviously, threat actors are harder. It is a harder challenge to deal with than vulnerabilities where there are ones and zeros of code and there's a lot more certainty you can find. But if you look at those challenges and compare it to vulnerabilities, in vulnerability space, we know what we're talking about in the CVE program, which grew up from doing a couple of vulnerabilities at a time to now there are tens of thousands that they process every year. It's used across the world, and it is a huge value add both to cyber defenders and to folks looking at how to improve secure by design. So this is why it was so important that this pillar of cybersecurity critical infrastructure continues to prosper.
Do you think we're going to have a day where, I'm going to pull a threat actor, so it is confusing. Every vendor has their own taxonomy and name for different actors. Do you think we'll ever see that coming together? Because I'm not sure most of our viewers and listeners probably are aware, but for example, the Typhoon's Microsoft. Everyone calls it something a little different, though. So
right, and I think it's going to be challenging because there are marketing dollars to be made, and saying, here it is. And it's also going to be challenging because the ground truth is harder to come by. But we have seen efforts this year from industry to start to say we need to have some more of a taxonomy. And we've seen MITRE, who's involved in the CVE program as well, with their attack framework also start to say, well, can we at least deconstruct which pieces a threat actor is interested in so we can look at a profile. But you look at the challenges that exist in trying to deal with threat actor identification and management and say, yeah, isn't it great we don't have to deal with that in vulnerability management? That is because of the CVE program. But the CVE program is 26 years old, and some of it has not had a major look at in those 26 years externally, and cracks are beginning to show.
Give us that status update. What are some of the concerns from a governance perspective or anything else?
Yeah, so we kind of, CVE was when I was on the Hill and then at the White House, I would call it was in my 3 months away bucket of starting in 2016, some of those cracks started to show in terms of how the existing governance structure, could it expand to deal with the massive numbers of vulnerabilities as software has eaten the world. But it was always on the I'll get to it. It's important, but not quite urgent enough to deal with.
Things are on fire. It's
That's
all
right.
relative, right? Yeah.
And
5 alarm, 4 alarm, 3 alarm, yeah.
Last year, we got pretty close because the National Vulnerability Database, which is run by NIST, it had some funding issues, and it is built on top of CVE. And at the White House, there were lots of conversations. We were getting calls. One of my colleagues, Drennan Dudley, who is a budget wizard, was trying to work with NIST to figure out how do we get funding for this program because it is relied on by the community. And in April of this year, we saw a similar funding problem where the CVE advisory board got a letter from MITRE that said there are contract issues, and unless they get resolved in the next 24 hours, we have to shut down. And that caused a huge tectonic shift in the community, and people in industry, people in international governments calling folks in CISA, folks in the broader community to say, what's going on and how do we fix this? And that immediate crisis got fixed. The contract was fixed and CISA is back to funding the program, but it exposed a lot of challenges that had been underlying and sort of brought them to the fore.
So, crisis averted, yet where should the CVE program, what should it look like? And clearly, internationally, it plays a significant role as well, and I know other countries have similar programs. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so where we started with the paper was looking at, well, what's the thing that we're trying to avoid, and that's fragmentation. I mean, you and I have talked before about the importance of cybersecurity regulatory harmonization, of saying we need to get people on the same page. We do not want to spend time on compliance that should be spent on security. And CVE is an example of we already got it right. There already is this one universal identifier that's used, and what we don't want to see is that going backwards. And when you had this funding crisis, all of a sudden people started to say, can we rely on this program, right? It's got one funder. It's not been terribly transparent. The governance structure is definitely not what you would expect for a program that's this important for our global cybersecurity. So we started from the premise of how do you avoid fragmentation? And core to that, we have a couple of things we had in mind, right? First and foremost, we have to be clear what we're talking about. And one challenge that we ran into immediately is people said to us, well, what about NVD, the National Vulnerability Database in the United States? What about the European Union Vulnerability Database? What about Japan Vulnerability Notes, right? There are a bunch of other databases. And we said, right. People should do that. There are national security reasons too. There are regulatory reasons too. But we need a policy framework where we can say this part of the system needs to be global, needs to be singular. That's where it derives the value. And then you build national or regional vulnerability management programs on top of that. And that's the policy framework that we lay out in the paper is you say, look, you want to have a global vulnerability catalog that has a diversity of funding. It isn't just reliant on a single government to provide that. It has transparent governance structure that includes representatives from other governments. And that is to ensure that this harmonized identification system remains. And then on top of that, you bring the value add that's important for your national security, or things like CISA's Known Exploited Vulnerabilities Catalog, which has been greeted by acclaim in the community because it helps people prioritize, but it's based on what CISA has observed. And it's great. CISA should keep doing that. That's a core part of our national vulnerability management program, but that's separate and apart from the global identifiers. CISA keys their KEV catalog to these CVEs, and that's what we want to continue, and we want the Europeans to do the same.
So just help our viewers understand how it is administered today. So in terms of CISA's role and obviously MITRE and others who help support that effort.
It's a great question. So essentially, right, MITRE created the CVE program and largely administers it for CISA through one of their federally funded research and development centers with the Department of Homeland Security. There is also an advisory board, the CVE board, that is made up of volunteers, many of whom have spent literally tens of thousands of hours building this program. No compensation, just because they believe it's good for the internet. But they do not have any real control over the system. It's just MITRE and CISA. And there is also, again, no diversity of funding. The only dollars that are coming in is through CISA. And from our perspective, we look at this and we look at the administration's priorities and saying, hey, we, the United States, have been subsidizing security in a whole host of domains for a long time. This would be one of those cases where, Uncle Sam has been paying for 26 years for the globe to have this benefit, and we need it. We get benefit too, but we need to see other folks pony up as well.
And would you see industry playing a role in a new governance structure where they
absolutely
have a bigger seat at the table?
Yeah, I think that, again, from our standpoint, we start from the premise of fragmentation is what we're trying to avoid. Governments are the greatest risk of fragmentation. The EU already almost fragmented.
Yep.
And it was only thanks to U.S. companies, the U.S. government going to partners in the European Commission and ENISA and saying, no, guys, you need to create your EUVD. You're required to do it by law. That's well and good. And in our policy framework, we would call that a regional vulnerability management program. That's great. But index it to CVEs. And they did. But I'm not sure they would make that same decision today based on the challenges earlier. So governments need to be involved. And then industry also has to have a seat at the table, whether that's directly as part of the governance model, whether it's through a more powerful advisory board. The worst case is fragmentation. The second worst is government comes in and says, we're going to supplant the expertise that's been built up over 25 years and say, no, the analogy I use when we launched this is the 10,000 meter screwdriver and being like, oh yeah, from way up high, we'll tell you exactly how to do this thing. That's not going to help.
So how do you think it plays out?
Great question. From our perspective, right, if you look at the recommendations we put in the paper, we really lean in on the need for U.S. leadership here, right? We have already done yeoman's work in single-handedly funding this program for 25 years, but we need some more leadership to lay out a strategic vision. And I think CISA is starting to get down that road. They put out a vision statement in September, but I'm afraid it's not quite as inclusive as maybe it needs to be. And really where that inclusivity is, first and foremost, is with other governments. And it can't just be the Five Eyes, right? Again, to prevent fragmentation, EU is the 10,000-pound gorilla that we need to include in these conversations. ASEAN partners, too, would be great. Singaporeans are really good on this stuff. But our proposal is to say, this is actually something that the new National Cyber Director, Director Cairncross, is right in his wheelhouse, because this is a whole of government challenge. It needs one voice going out there to say, yep, we can go negotiate out some framework that'll ensure there's continued funding from a diverse stream of folks, and also bring industry to the table, which I know Director Cairncross has really leaned into in his first couple months on the job.
Well said. And I would just underscore and foot stomp that the governance structure could never be in the hands of Beijing, Moscow, Tehran, you name it, so Pyongyang and others. Let's transition to perhaps it's got all the hallmarks of SolarWinds, but obviously we don't know the consequences and the implications fully. But the F5 breach, again, a technology that 80% of the Fortune 500 utilize in one fashion or another, helps with filtering and directing internet traffic. And again, it's a little bit like SolarWinds, that everyone's got it under their hood and they didn't realize it, or at least I wasn't fully read in on that. Let's talk about the F5 breach, why it matters, and what we know so far.
Yeah, I think the SolarWinds analogy is really apt, because it's something that is critical to the functioning of the internet. It's used all over the place, and most people don't know because it just works, right? It's you don't have to think about, when you're sending a request in, which
Parts
web
is parts,
server
right?
is actually going to be right.
Yeah,
Which web server it's going to serve, and F5's technology has been critical to that. But what they announced on October 15th in a regulatory filing was that in August they'd learned that there had been long-term persistent access to really some of the crown jewels of their network, which included their development environment. So where they're writing the software that powers the tools that they provide. Again, for me, that was immediate alarm bells to SolarWinds, because if you look at SolarWinds, this is where the Russians were. And, the good news, we can hope, is that it was discovered by the victim. SolarWinds obviously discovered by Mandiant, who had to call up SolarWinds and say, we don't know how we got breached. It took us a long time. We figured out it was you. So it is possible that this stuff hasn't been operationalized yet, but it's also possible that we just haven't picked it up yet, because as we've seen through some of the other typhoon activity, the Chinese are getting really good at operational security. And it may also be that we pay the price for this in 4 years, where people are looking through the source code and saying, okay, now we've got the Sparks nodes, right? Now we can go and develop our vulnerabilities in a way that is really informed by what's actually going on under the hood. So that's all really concerning. There's also an immediate tactical problem, which is there was a patch released with the announcement with 44 vulnerabilities that were documented internally to F5 at the time. And that means that, as best we can tell, the bad guys got access to those as well and may have been able to develop exploits. So key message is, if you've got any of this technology, patch. But I think the part that's really interesting to me as a policymaker is, if this is, it sounds so much like SolarWinds, didn't we put a bunch of policy in place to stop SolarWinds?
Yeah.
And the answer is, we did. If you look at Executive Order 14028 came out of the Biden administration in May of 2021. I was still on the Hill at the time. And we looked at it and it's like, this is tailor-made to deal with challenges from SolarWinds. Both on the operator side, where we've actually seen it work really well. I mean, I think it is criminally underreported, underappreciated how good the State Department actors were that uncovered the Storm 0558 actors. That was government cyber professionals who are uncovering a persistent Chinese cyber campaign because of reforms we made in 14028. Great. But on the software supply chain security side, which was really the bulk, looking at contractors to the federal government and putting more requirements in place for them to have secure software, that came out in the immediate aftermath of SolarWinds, and it has not been implemented.
And to me, and again, I'm pontificating here, I don't have all the facts, but it seems like a prelude to the typhoons in many ways. Because, one thing that has been publicly disclosed is source code was stolen, and also undisclosed vulnerabilities, in essence 0 days, that are at least one actor knew, but all things said and done, that's a pretty big deal, given our dependency, again, on one of these bits of technologies that most people would not immediately wake up and say that's essential to our economy, our national security, our public safety, but it is.
Oh, absolutely, and it is very consistent with tactics that we have seen, particularly from sophisticated nation-state actors.
A little bit like living off the land, because the dwell time was pretty long, right?
Yeah.
They notified quickly, so I think based on what I've seen, as soon as they identified, they went to justice, and they did do their notifications quickly, but they were in the system for a while.
Long-term persistent is what they said. So that is not precise, but it is concerning. And the tactics-wise, going after edge devices, right? Things that are not your normal laptop or desktop, although not so much today, is where we have seen attackers move, especially for initial access in the typhoons all over the place. And it's just further evidence.
Got all the hallmarks.
Right.
Yeah.
Listen to NSA when they say, like, go defend these things, because Rob Joyce was beating this drum in 2017 and saying protect your edge devices. And that is one of the better predictions that you will ever see in cybersecurity land. But again, I think as a policymaker, you look and say, we were so close, right? We had the right ingredients in 14028 to be able to address these kind of issues and to say, protect your development environments because we know the bad guys are going to go after them. And yet, the FAR Council has never even issued a draft rule implementing the secure software supply chain requirements from 14028.
Yeah, and I would not be surprised if another shoe drops on this particular case, to say the least. And more importantly, it just underscores yet again the challenges around supply chain security, right? So even beyond F5, it took companies a long time to even recognize and identify whether or not they had SolarWinds in their systems. We can't afford that this go around, can we?
Absolutely not. And again, we have tools to address that. In Train, it's just that they have been stuck in this regulatory body. And, I am a firm believer that the government should lead by example, and one of the ways that you lead by example is through your procurement power and saying we are going to be secure by demand. We are going to demand better actions from our vendors and from our suppliers. But that only works if you can actually implement it.
Absolutely.
And we are failing at the last mile here, where we've got all of the ingredients in place for tools that will actually affect this, but then they go into the FAR Council and they disappear. And it was very heartening for me to see the current administration doubling down and saying in their EO, yep, we're not rescinding 14028. The FAR Council's latest unified agenda says, yep, we're going to keep moving forward with these new rules. I'm just like, after 4 years plus, almost 4.5, we need sustained attention from senior leadership to say, no, you actually have to do this, and cyber might not be the thing that's first and foremost on your mind, but it is where our nation-state adversaries are going.
And it's the difference between nouns and verbs and actually doing it. So
100%.
One of the other, so this is software, and we've also got supply chain issues around hardware. And then you've got really confounding is firmware. So we're very early innings in being able to have any visibility into our supply chain. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that I think...
Which is scary if you think about it. If you don't know what's in your system, I mean, if you're eating poison all day, you die. So we've got to figure out what that ingesting all this could look like, right?
Yeah, looking at ingredients lists, right, is the analogy that's normally used for good reason, right? Which is, I think a lot of folks that are outside the cyber policy domain don't really have a great sense of how little we might know about what components are on that motherboard. It's just kind of like it shows up and it's there.
It works sometimes.
Right.
So, yeah. And if it doesn't work, it's expected that it doesn't work, which was an old World War II UK. That's how they deceived the Nazis, but in terms of radar. So there are analogies here. But so early innings, what else should we be thinking in terms of F5? Do you think that there's been any impact of the lapsing of CISA 2015 and sharing of information with the government? I think we're still early stages, so we don't know, but I'd be curious what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, I mean, my general hope on CISA 15 at the moment is that the lawyers don't listen to your podcast, right? Because that is the thing.
It'll stop sharing.
One of my colleagues at IST was like, Megan Stiefel, who is a former Justice Department official, was like, yeah, the problem is, as it always was, the lawyers. That's the problem with this lapse.
Absolutely.
And
put the lawyers in the driver's seat, not the security.
Like they are back in the room to the extent that they've caught up on it. And my concern is the longer this lapse goes, the more likely the lawyers start to say, yep, we need to be in these conversations. And it's why it's so critical that we get a reauthorization. And while I am, as a former Hill watcher, current Hill watcher, former Hill denizen, very confident that when the government reopens, we will get a short-term extension of these authorities. That is no substitute for a permanent reauthorization.
Absolutely.
And we need to find a vehicle that we can get a permanent reauthorization on, because otherwise all the wheels are just going to be spinning, much like this government funding fight right now to get an extra 3 months of CISA 2015 liability protections.
And trust is everything here. And if the government isn't seen as a trusted partner, if it can't live up to its end of the bargain, you're going to see industry maybe look at this a little differently. It's taken so long to get us to where we are, which is nowhere where we need to be. To step backwards a decade would be negligible.
Yeah, it's
wrong.
Very, very much so. And it's similar to, like, we need to see some more leaning in with industry on some of the critical infrastructure partnership authorities that allow the sector coordinating councils to talk about policy. Like, you hear testimony after testimony from folks in industry saying, please bring this back, because it was an effective tool for talking with folks. And that's separate from CISA 2015. It's like all of these, to ensure that the government continues to be looked at as a trusted partner. Communication is 90% of the battle. And when you can't have communication because you're afraid it's going to be FOIA'd because of the Federal Advisory Committee Act, for whatever reason, that's when trust starts to break down.
Well said. We're coming near the end of our time, but you've also written a bunch about breaches in the U.S. court system, which I'm not sure most people have been paying a whole lot of attention to. Anything you want to bring up here for our viewers and listeners?
Yeah, this is just one of those things that's vaguely terrifying, and it takes a lot to terrify me after 15 years in this space. But as best we can tell from public reporting, either there's been one continuous breach since 2020, or at least similar types of actors are continually being able to get into the federal court system. And I think it's really important that policymakers look at this as a case study for what happens when a well and truly sophisticated adversary gets onto something that's really important. Because the courts have been raising this as an issue for years, and they have done an admirable job from my standpoint as the administrative office of the courts, saying, we have a problem here, this is something we need to resource against. And what they have not found is super receptive voices in Congress or even in the administration, is something that we tried to help them with. But trying to get support, the branches are distinct for a reason, and there are good elements to that, but this is one of those areas where it's falling down.
Is this a funding issue primarily?
It is absolutely a funding issue. And it really speaks to, again, like, policymakers, I really like this as a case study, because a lot of the challenges that they're facing are applicable in other scenarios, and you just see it so clearly with the courts where they're asking for more funding, they're getting some of it, and that they have to use just to instrument to be able to see, oh, we are well and truly owned, but they didn't get enough money to actually fix the problem.
Yeah.
And it's
and
just
we've seen
terrifying.
that movie before, right? I mean, in terms of back office functions and criticality to actually getting things done, it's amazing. Whether it was healthcare sector, we've seen a turnaround there, or law firms themselves, and they hold a lot of sensitive data.
Absolutely. I mean this is one of the cases for me where it's like, this is the U.S. government where we know that there is sensitive information that would be interesting to nation states there. So from a confidentiality standpoint, it's a problem. But from an integrity standpoint, it is off the charts. Right? Like, if people lose trust in the court system, that is being held at risk right now. And I do not know Like, the courts have been trying to broadcast this for years, and it has not landed. And that is an active, ongoing, we're being held at risk today, that is not really getting attention that I think it deserves. And again, really points to challenges in how you think about cybersecurity policy solutions, of being like, we can't just give you enough to be able to tell, oh yeah, I'm owned. We got to be able to come in with actual solutions so that we're not just like, okay, now we're aware that you're here, but we can't really do anything about it.
I often say policy without resources is rhetoric.
I use that line all the time, Frank.
Is there anything beyond resources that or is this largely?
They are very eager for operational collaboration as well. And again, like, I lived through some of these challenges that we had with Article 1, when, thanks to some very forward-looking folks in the Committee on House Administration, they said, what if there's a major breach of Congress? We don't have inherent capabilities to respond to it. Like, you're going to exceed what we can do as just the House very quickly. But how do we bring in the FBI in a way that preserves, or CISA, or Cybercom, or anyone, that preserves constitutional prerogatives for the legislative branch? And like, we need something on steroids real fast to look at that issue for the courts to say, again, the U.S. government might be party to some of these cases. There might be files that are protected from the Department of Justice from being seen at the moment. Like, these are hard problems to deal with, but they are problems we should have solved 10 years ago. We need to solve them today. We cannot just sit here and say, yes, we recognize nation states have access to our court systems. What are you going to do?
Nick, you've laid out so much here. We could go on for hours, and in all sincerity, so much to think about. But the tyranny of time requires I be a little bit of a tyrant, and I'm going to ask one last question. What question didn't I ask that I should have?
Well, Frank, you brought it up, resources. And again, I cannot tell you how many times you were the first person that I heard with the policy without resources is rhetoric. We talked about that in the White House all the time. And it's still appropriation season. Hopefully we will no longer see a lapse, but there are a couple of things that are really important on the spending side that I think it's worth highlighting. Top couple. So one is a very bright spot from the administration's budget request is for the Environmental Protection Agency, grants for cybersecurity, for water. The Biden administration put some money in there in the FY25 budget. It was not funded by Congress. The Trump administration doubled down. It really needs to happen. Water is,
from a public safety
very
standpoint,
vulnerable.
It's at the top of the list, and it's by no means at the top of the list of security. So,
And one other area like that I would highlight is K through 12 schools. The FCC ran an incredibly successful pilot in trying to bring more cybersecurity resources to K through 12 schools. Over the last year, it is done. It is a perfect pilot program where it's like, let's try it out. Let's see if it worked like gangbusters. It did. It's been incredibly effective, but it needs Congress to stand in as part of Universal Service Fund reform and say, on a permanent basis, we're going to ensure that you can use some of the money you're getting from the Universal Service Fund, not just to buy state-of-the-art 2001 basic network appliance firewalls, but the tools that you actually need to protect yourself today.
Nick, thank you for spending so much time with us today. Thank you for all your hard work in this space. I failed to mention even your National Cyber Director role when I introduced you, so you've done so much that I had already forgotten about that. So thank you for all you've done. Thank you for spending time with us, and keep doing good things.
Thanks, Frank.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Cyber Focus. If you liked what you heard, please consider subscribing. Your ratings and reviews help us reach more listeners. Drop us a line if you have any ideas in terms of topics, themes, or individuals you'd like for us to host. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and stay curious.